Was a single fateful decision worth the price of so much anger and regret? The question hung heavy in the stale, recycled air of the courtroom, an invisible weight pressing down on every soul present. It was a question that had no easy answer, only the shifting perspectives of two people who now faced each other across a chasm of mutual blame. On a nondescript Tuesday in a small, windowless chamber in the heart of Atlanta's sprawling courthouse complex, the universe had conspired to bring a young man and a woman, strangers until a few months ago, together to settle a dispute over a crumpled fender and a fractured sense of fairness. The air was thick with tension, a low hum of anxiety punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of Judge Judy's pen on her worn wooden desk. She was a force of nature in her black robe, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen it all. She had heard 1,000 stories just like this one, tales of carelessness and inattention, of split-second decisions with life-altering consequences. This particular drama, she knew, had its roots in an intersection on a busy Atlanta road, but its full weight had fallen squarely on the shoulders of the two individuals before her. A young man barely out of his teens stood on the left, his hands clasped nervously behind his back. He was a tangle of limbs and nervous energy, his clothes a little too big, his hair a little too shaggy. He was the one who had been driving the uninsured car. A woman a few years older stood on the right, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of controlled fury. Her car had been insured, but she had come to court anyway, a decision driven by a need for justice beyond what an insurance company could provide. Her hands were balled into fists at her sides, and her jaw was clenched tight. The judge's gaze swept from one to the other, her silence a powerful tool. She let the tension build, the unspoken accusations and simmering resentments hanging in the air like a thick fog. This was the prelude, the opening act of a drama that had been building since a warm April afternoon. The judge knew that beneath the surface of this mundane car accident case lay a deeper conflict, a clash of two very different worlds. One world was one of privilege and responsibility, where the rules were followed and the consequences of missteps were buffered by the safety net of insurance. The other was a world of risk and chance, where the rules were often bent or broken, and the consequences were immediate and severe. She saw it in the way the young man fidgeted, a constant, small movement that spoke of deep-seated anxiety and a feeling of being out of his depth. She saw it in the woman's unyielding stance, a silent demand for the universe to right a wrong that had been done to her. Finally, the judge broke the silence, her voice a sharp, clear instrument that cut through the suffocating tension. "This is a case," she began, her words deliberate and slow, "where one party alleges that the other is responsible for an automobile accident that occurred in April of this year. Is that correct?" She looked at the young man first, her eye pinning him in place. "Correct," he said, his voice a little hoarse, his head bobbing in a quick, jerky nod. The judge turned to the woman. "And you agree?" "Yes," she said, her voice a tight whisper, her face a mask of stone. "Were you driving your own car?" the judge asked the young man, her tone shifting to a more rapid-fire interrogation. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his shoulders slumping a little. "Were you driving your own car?" the judge repeated, turning to the woman. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her head held high. The judge paused, letting the simple fact of their shared ownership hang in the air for a moment. She knew the next question was the one that would lay bare the heart of the matter. "Was your car insured?" she asked the woman. "Yes," the woman answered, her voice a little louder, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Was your car insured?" the judge asked the young man, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "No, ma'am." A collective sigh, so faint it was barely audible, seemed to escape from the gallery, a small, shared moment of understanding. The judge, however, remained impassive. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, a small but significant shift that indicated she was about to get to the point. "That's why we're here," she said, her voice a flat statement of fact. The young man seemed to flinch, his face coloring. "Yes, ma'am, but the accident was my fault." "So?" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the floor, as if the tiles held the secret to his legal troubles. His confession, a small, desperate olive branch, was a testament to his naivete. He seemed to think that admitting fault was enough, that the moral weight of his admission would somehow absolve him of the legal and financial burden he was about to face. He didn't understand that the law was not a morality play. It was a cold, hard system of rules and regulations. The woman, on the other hand, reacted with a small, sharp intake of breath, a flash of surprise in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to admit it so easily. It was a momentary victory for her, but one that was quickly snatched away by the judge's next words. The judge leaned forward slightly, her pen tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against her desk, the sound echoing in the silence. She was about to deliver the unvarnished truth, the kind of blunt, no-nonsense reality check she was famous for. "Well, if you had insurance," the judge said, her voice filled with a kind of weary finality, "the insurance company would have dealt with that." Her words were a scalpel, cutting away the young man's half-formed excuse and exposing the raw, bleeding truth of his situation. His lack of insurance was not a side issue. It was the central, defining fact of this case. The woman, she knew, understood this. It was why she was there, a silent acknowledgement that the system in this case had failed her. She had done everything right, had followed all the rules, and yet here she was in a small claims courtroom because someone else had not. The young man's face fell, the hope draining from his eyes. He seemed to shrink in on himself, a fragile figure in a courtroom that suddenly felt 1,000 times bigger. The judge's words had a chilling clarity, a brutal logic that left no room for sentiment or excuses. The woman, watching his reaction, felt a strange mix of emotions, a sense of vindication, yes, but also a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was the dawning realization that this was not just a legal battle, but a human one, with two very different people standing on opposite sides of a divide that had been created by a single careless act. The judge's words, "the insurance company would have dealt with that," hung in the air, a testament to the safety net that had protected one driver and abandoned the other. The judge's gaze shifted back to the young man. She saw the fear in his eyes, the dawning understanding of the legal peril he was in. He had come to court expecting to simply apologize and move on, but he had entered a world of cold, hard legal precedent. His admission of fault, he now realized, was not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It was a confession that could be used against him. The woman, too, felt the weight of the moment. She had been so focused on the injustice of the situation, on the fact that she had to be here at all, that she had forgotten the human element. The young man wasn't just a faceless, irresponsible driver. He was a person, a kid who had made a mistake with potentially life-altering consequences. Her anger, she realized, was a complicated emotion, born not just of the accident itself, but of the feeling that her world had been disrupted by someone who played by different rules. The judge's voice, when she spoke again, was softer, but no less authoritative. "Clear," she said, a single word that served as a transition from the procedural to the substantive. She was done with the preliminaries, with the mundane questions of ownership and insurance. Now she was ready to get to the heart of the matter, to the moment that had brought them all here. Her eyes, those keen, penetrating eyes, swept from the young man to the woman, and then back again. "So then," she said, a slight pause for emphasis, "why are we here?" It was a rhetorical question, of course, but it was also a bridge, a signal that they were moving from the realm of abstract legal principles to the messy, complicated reality of what had happened on that day in April. She knew the answer was simple, but the truth was anything but. The truth was a tangled mess of conflicting narratives, of two different people with two different memories of a single crucial moment. The woman would say she had the green light. The young man would say the same. And the judge, she knew, would have to untangle the web of lies and half-truths to find the single, elusive fact that would decide this case. Her final question, "So then why are we here?" was a challenge, a dare to both of them to finally tell their stories, to lay their cards on the table. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation, the quiet calm before the storm. The courtroom, so still and quiet just moments before, now felt charged with a new energy, a sense of an impending confrontation. The two drivers who had been locked in a silent standoff now had to speak, to explain, to justify their presence in the courtroom. The judge was not just a mediator. She was a catalyst, forcing them to confront the central, defining question of the case. Who had the green? The air in the courtroom, already thick with unspoken tension, seemed to grow even heavier with the judge's final question. The young man who had confessed to a lack of insurance and, by extension, a lack of responsibility, was now forced to confront the deeper, more complex layer of his legal predicament. His confession had not bought him the peace he had hoped for. Instead, it had only opened the door to a more rigorous cross-examination. His past and present collided in the small, sterile room, and there was no hiding from the judge's relentless inquiry. The judge, having established the central issue of insurance, now moved on to a more granular investigation, one that would test the young man's credibility and the very foundation of his defense. The woman, watching from the other side of the room, felt a shift in the power dynamic. She had been on the defensive, justifying her presence in court. Now the tables had turned and the focus was squarely on her opponent, a change that brought a surge of grim satisfaction. The judge's voice, a steady, unwavering probe, cut through the silence. "Is your car insured now?" she asked the young man, her eyes fixed on him, searching for any sign of a lie. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, before his head bobbed in a quick, affirmative nod. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice a little stronger this time, as if the act of having insurance now gave him some small measure of confidence. It was a gesture of belated compliance, a sign that he had learned his lesson. But the judge was not interested in what he had done. She was interested in what he had failed to do. "Were you given a ticket for not having insurance?" she asked, her voice sharp and direct. "No, ma'am," he replied, a small note of surprise in his voice. It was an answer that seemed to both relieve and confuse him. He had expected a ticket, had been prepared for it, but the police officer at the scene had not issued one. He didn't know why, and the judge's next question would make it clear that his ignorance was no excuse. "Why not?" the judge pressed, her tone growing more incredulous. "Don't police ask regularly for license, registration, and insurance?" It was a question that was part rhetorical, part genuine curiosity. She knew the answer, of course, but she wanted to hear it from him, to force him to confront the gaping hole in his story. His claim that the police did not routinely check for insurance was so preposterous that it was almost comical. She saw the woman on the other side of the room stare, her eyes narrowing. She had a different perspective, a different memory of that day, and she was not about to let the young man's flimsy excuse go unchallenged. "No, ma'am," the young man insisted, a stubborn streak of denial hardening his features. "They don't." He seemed to genuinely believe this, a testament to his naivete or perhaps a deliberate attempt to mislead the court. The woman, however, was not about to let this misrepresentation stand. "Yes, ma'am," she interjected, her voice cutting through the young man's, a note of triumph in her tone. "They do. On the police report, he stated that he had nationwide." She held up a document, a crisp white sheet of paper that seemed to glow with the weight of its damning revelation. It was the police report, the official record of what had transpired at the intersection of La Vista and North Druid Hills. It was the irrefutable evidence that she had sought, the tangible proof that her opponent had not only been uninsured, but had also lied about it at the scene of the accident. The young man's face paled, his bravado evaporating in a single gut-wrenching moment. He had been caught, and the judge, like a predator who had just spotted its prey, was about to close in for the kill. "May I see it, please?" the judge asked the woman, her voice a low purr. She took the document, her eyes scanning the page with a practiced speed. She had seen countless police reports, each one a dry, factual account of a human drama. But this one was different. This one had a lie at its heart, a lie that had allowed the young man to escape a ticket and, for a time, to evade the consequences of his actions. She held the report up, a silent accusation, before turning her gaze back to the young man. "You told the police you had nationwide insurance." It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, a declaration of his guilt. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice now a desperate, panicked whisper. "I've been with USAA since 17 years, ma'am." He was clinging to this single verifiable fact, a small island of truth in a sea of his own making. The irony was not lost on the judge. He was trying to prove his credibility by confessing to a different lie. He had not lied about his insurance company. He had lied about having an insurance company at all. His claim that he was a longtime member of USAA was an attempt to shift the focus to distract from the core issue of his lack of insurance at the time of the accident. The judge, however, was not so easily swayed. "So they made this up," she said, her voice laced with a withering sarcasm, "when they said, 'insurance company nationwide.'" She was pointing out the absurdity of his claim. He was suggesting that the police officer, a trained professional, had fabricated a piece of information for no reason, and that the woman who had simply provided a copy of the official report was also lying. It was a desperate and transparent attempt to deflect blame, and it only served to further erode his credibility. The young man stood there, silent and defeated, the weight of his own lies pressing down on him. The woman, on the other hand, watched with a quiet satisfaction. She had known the truth, and now the judge had confirmed it. The police report, the CSPR, with its single damning line, had been her secret weapon, the proof she had needed to validate her frustration. Having exposed the young man's lack of credibility, the judge moved on to a more neutral topic, a simple line of inquiry that would, in the end, reveal another layer of their characters. "What kind of car were you driving?" she asked the woman, her voice returning to its more rapid-fire, businesslike cadence. The woman seemed to relax a little, her posture softening. She had been waiting for this question, a chance to talk about her car, her carefully maintained vehicle that had been damaged by a careless driver. "I had a 2013 Nissan Rogue," she said, her voice filled with a subtle but unmistakable note of pride. A 2013 Nissan Rogue, the judge knew what that meant. It meant a car that was relatively new, well-maintained, and a responsible choice. It spoke of a driver who was organized, careful, and took pride in their possessions. It was a tangible representation of her character, a stark contrast to the young man's. "And you, sir?" the judge asked, turning her attention back to the young man. He seemed to shrink a little, a visible reaction to the contrast between his vehicle and the woman's. 2003 Infinity, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A 2003 Infinity. The words hung in the air, a silent testament to the vast gulf between the two drivers. A car that was 10 years older than the woman's, a vehicle that had likely seen better days. It was a car that spoke of a different reality, one of limited resources and a life lived closer to the edge. It was a vehicle that, in the judge's experienced eyes, was not just a car, but a symbol of its owner's life, a life of risk and chance, of making do with what you had. The judge saw it all, the worn leather, the faded paint, the small dents and dings that told a story of a long and difficult life. She saw the Nissan Rogue as a symbol of responsible adulthood, and the Infinity as a symbol of youthful recklessness. The cars, in their own silent way, were telling a story of two different lives that had collided on a single fateful afternoon. The judge, her mind already moving on to the next phase of the hearing, looked from one driver to the other. She had all the information she needed, the insured and the uninsured, the truth teller and the liar, the responsible car owner and the reckless one. The subtext of the case was now as clear as the light of day, but the truth was not yet fully revealed. She knew that the core of the case, the single unyielding fact that would decide everything, had yet to be discussed. She had to get to the moment of the accident itself, to the intersection, to the question of who had the green light. She had all the human drama, all the character information, all the backstory she needed. Now it was time to get to the action. She leaned back in her chair, her pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper. She knew the next step was to create a diagram of the intersection, to force them to recreate the scene of the crime, to lay bare their conflicting versions of events. The courtroom, which had been so focused on the drivers and their cars, was about to turn its attention to the roads themselves, to the geography of the accident, to the single moment that had brought them all here. The judge's voice, when it came, was a simple directive, a command that would shift the focus from the characters to the plot. She was ready to move on, to dig into the heart of the matter. The question of who had the green light was now the only thing left to answer. The silence that had settled over the courtroom was broken by the judge's voice, a crisp, clear question that sliced through the tension like a blade. The preliminaries were over. The question of insurance, the matter of the police report, the disparity of their cars, all of it had been a prelude. Now the judge was getting to the core of the issue, the one that had brought two strangers, two very different worlds, to this small room. She looked at the woman, her eyes unblinking. Where were you going? The question was simple, but its answer would begin to lay the groundwork for the entire narrative of the crash. The woman, Miss McIntosh, took a breath, her mind returning to that night in April. Actually, ma'am, she began, her voice a little softer now, as if she were talking to herself, remembering. I was going toward a lounge. The word lounge conjured an image of a late-night destination, a place of relaxation and quiet enjoyment, a far cry from the harsh reality of the courtroom. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. What time? She asked. I think about 10:30, ma'am, Ms. McIntosh replied. The time the judge knew was crucial, 10:30 p.m. It was a time of night when traffic would be lighter, the streets quieter, but the potential for high-speed travel would be greater. The judge leaned forward, her gaze now a silent command. Why don't you go over to the Ms. McIntosh and show me where your car was and how you were traveling? Ms. McIntosh, her face a mask of focus, walked to a large easel in the center of the room. On it was a simple, hand-drawn diagram of a four-way intersection. It was a crude but effective representation of the crossroads of La Vista and North Druid Hills. She picked up a small toy car, a stand-in for her 2013 Nissan Rogue, and placed it on the diagram. It was a moment of pure theatricality, a silent reenactment of a traumatic event. This is La Vista and North Druid Hills Road, she said, her finger tracing the two lines that crossed at a perfect right angle. I'm this car. She pointed to the toy car she had just placed on the diagram. I was coming down North Druid Hills. Her voice took on a narrative quality, a calm, methodical recounting of a chaotic event. The light was green, so as I was coming upon the intersection, I seen him turning, and I said, he's not going to make it, and I just braced for impact, and that's when we collided. Her words painted a vivid picture, a driver with a clear green light, a car coming at her, and a moment of stark, terrible premonition. The words, he's not going to make it, hung in the air, a chilling echo of a split-second decision that had led to so much damage and so much anger. The young man, listening from his side of the courtroom, fidgeted, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. He wanted to object, to shout that her version of events was a lie, but he was silenced by the judge's unblinking stare. The judge, her attention fixed on the diagram, asked a simple but loaded question. What kind of road is this? Ms. McIntosh, still in her narrative state, answered matter-of-factly. It's a regular four-section intersection. The judge nodded, her eyes now searching for a different kind of truth. How fast were you going? She asked. The question was a trap, a subtle shift in the line of inquiry. Ms. McIntosh, however, answered without hesitation. About 40-45. The number hung in the air, a speed that, in a 35-mile-per-hour zone, could be considered excessive. The judge, her face a mask of stone, spoke a single word. Excessive. The word was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, a sudden dramatic turn in the narrative. The woman who had been so sure of her righteousness now found herself on the defensive. Her speed, a minor detail in her mind, was now being used as a weapon against her. She had been going too fast. The young man, seeing his opening, felt a surge of hope. This was it. This was the crack in her story, the single point of weakness he had been looking for. He knew with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying that the judge had just given him an opening, a chance to turn the tide. He had been so focused on defending himself against her, on arguing about his lack of insurance and his lies, that he had forgotten to question her own narrative. Now, with the word excessive hanging in the air, he saw a path to victory. Her speed was a form of recklessness, a kind of carelessness that was no different from his own. It didn't matter who had the green light if one of the drivers was speeding. The accident, he now realized, could be framed as a result of her own negligence, not his. The judge, having delivered her verdict on Miss McIntosh's speed, turned to the young man. You can step back, she said to the woman, a silent signal that her part of the narrative was over, for now. The woman returned to her seat, her face a mask of controlled fury. She had been so close to winning, to having the judge side with her, but the single word excessive had thrown her off balance. She had done everything right, had followed all the rules, and yet here she was, in court, being questioned about her own actions. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. The judge now turned her attention to the young man, a silent invitation for him to speak. She had heard one version of the story, now she would hear the other. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. The young man, emboldened by the judge's reaction to the woman's testimony, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had been on the ropes, but now he had a fighting chance. His story, he knew, was the only one that mattered now. His version of events was the one that would decide everything. The question of who had the green light, which had been the central question of the case, now had a new layer of complexity. It was no longer just about who had the right of way. It was about who was going too fast, who was reckless, who was truly at fault. The judge's gaze was a powerful force, and the young man, now standing alone in the center of the room, felt its weight. She was not just asking him to tell his story, she was asking him to convince her, to make her believe him. He had no diagram, no toy car, nothing but his own words. He took a deep breath and began. His version of events, he knew, was the only one that mattered now. He would not talk about his lack of insurance or his lies to the police. He would talk about the light, the green arrow, the single, unassailable fact that would prove his innocence. "Your story is that you had a green arrow," the judge said, her voice a flat statement, a simple presentation of his defense. It was a chance for him to confirm, to say yes, to move on to the next part of his narrative. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice now strong and clear. The words were a defiant declaration, a refusal to back down, a statement of his own truth. He had been a liar and a cheat, but in this moment, he was a man with a story to tell, a story that he believed, a story that he hoped would set him free. The woman on the other side of the room gasped, a small, sharp intake of breath that was a mixture of disbelief and outrage. She had said the light was green. He was saying it was a green arrow. The difference between the two was everything. A green light gives a driver the right of way, but a green arrow gives them the right of way to turn, to cross the path of oncoming traffic. The young man was not just saying he had the green light. He was saying he had the right to turn, to cross her path, to be in the intersection at the moment of impact. It was a powerful defense, and the judge, she knew, would have to consider it. The judge, her face unreadable, looked from the young man to the woman and then back again. The two narratives were now in direct conflict, two different versions of a single crucial moment. The woman had her green light, the young man had his green arrow. It was a classic he said, she said scenario, a case that would come down to credibility in a single, uncorroborated fact. The judge knew that in cases like this, the truth was often obscured by a haze of conflicting memories, of half-truths and lies. She needed more. She needed something tangible, something outside of their conflicting narratives that would help her decide who was telling the truth. Her gaze swept the room, her eyes searching the faces in the gallery. She was looking for a witness, someone who had seen the accident, someone who could corroborate one of their stories. It was a long shot, she knew, but it was her only hope. She had to ask the question, to put it out there, to see if there was a single person in the world who had seen the light, the green light, or the green arrow that had caused so much damage. She had to find the truth, or at least a version of it that she could live with. Her final question, when it came, was a simple one, but it was loaded with the weight of her decision, with the burden of finding the truth. "Is there a witness?" she would ask. "Is there anyone here who can tell me what happened?" It was a Hail Mary, a last-ditch effort to find the truth in a sea of lies. The courtroom was silent, the two drivers, their stories in direct conflict, waiting for the judge to make her move. The case had come down to this, a single, uncorroborated fact, and the possibility of a witness who could settle the matter once and for all. The quiet of the courtroom, which had been so heavy with unspoken accusation, was now filled with a new, more procedural kind of tension. The judge had posed a question that was a shot in the dark, a last-ditch effort to find an impartial truth in a sea of conflicting narratives. She had asked if there was an independent witness, and the answer, she knew, would either seal the young man's fate or give him a fighting chance. The woman, Ms. McIntosh, her anger now tempered by a quiet sense of purpose, took a breath and responded. Her voice, which had been so full of fury, was now calm and methodical, as if she were a detective presenting a crucial piece of evidence. There was an independent witness that was on the side that spoke up and came forward and said, she began, her words a slow, deliberate unfolding of a new chapter in the case. The young man, hearing this, felt a sudden cold dread. He had been so focused on discrediting her story, on proving his own righteousness, that he had forgotten the possibility of an outside observer, someone who had seen everything without the bias of having been a participant. The judge, however, was not interested in what the witness said. She was interested in the process, in the cold, hard facts of the record. She cut Miss McIntosh off, her voice a sharp command. Didn't they just can't tell me what the witness said? It was a procedural mandate, a rule of evidence that she, in her years on the bench, had enforced 1,000 times. The young man's story was not on trial yet. The witness's statement was not yet admissible. The judge was simply establishing the fact of the witness's existence. Ms. McIntosh nodded. Yes, ma'am. The simple affirmation carried with it a powerful sense of vindication. She had been right all along. The judge's next question was the one that would open the floodgates. Did you get the name of the witness? The question hung in the air, a final check on the facts. Yes, ma'am, Ms. McIntosh replied, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. What's the name of the witness? The question was a procedural formality, but it was also a moment of intense, dramatic tension. The name of the witness was the key that would either unlock the truth or prove to be a dead end. The court, which had been so focused on the two drivers, was now about to turn its attention to a third party, a ghost in the machine who had seen everything. Ms. McIntosh paused, her mind returning to the scene of the accident, to the police report, to the name she had seen scrawled on the third page. Bleep Denham, she said, a small triumphant note in her voice. The name was a key, a small piece of a much larger puzzle, a single point of data that could decide the entire case. The judge, her face unreadable, jotted the name down. She was a woman who dealt in facts, not feelings, and the name was a fact. It was a tangible thing, a point of contact that she could use to find the truth. Do you have her information? The judge asked, her voice calm and authoritative. The young man, watching from the side, felt his heart sink. He knew what was coming next. He knew that if this witness confirmed Ms. McIntosh's story, he was in serious trouble. His lies, his lack of insurance, his reckless driving, all of it would come crashing down on him. Ms. McIntosh, however, was ready. Yes, ma'am, she said. It's on the police report, third page. The young man, hearing this, felt a surge of cold dread. He had tried to downplay the police report, to discredit it, but now it was coming back to haunt him. The report, he now realized, was not just a record of his lies. It was a record of the truth. The judge, her eyes fixed on the young man, delivered a cold, hard statement that was both a warning and a final verdict. So let's see if I can reach Ms. Denham. If not, it's not going to go well for you, sir, because you don't have insurance. You understand that, correct? The words were a sharp, brutal dose of reality. The judge was not mincing words. She was telling him, in no uncertain terms, that his lack of insurance was a legal liability that outweighed all other factors. He could have a witness, he could have 1,000,000 witnesses, but without insurance, he was on thin ice. The fact that he was uninsured meant that the burden of proof, the burden of his entire defense, was on him. He had to prove his innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt, and if the witness was not on his side, he was in serious trouble. The judge's words, "It's not going to go well for you," hung in the air, a powerful, chilling premonition of his impending doom. The young man, however, was not ready to give up. He was a man drowning, and he was grasping at any straw he could find. He had a witness of his own, he now realized, someone who had seen the accident from his perspective, someone who could corroborate his story. He had forgotten about this witness, had been so focused on the woman's accusations that he had not considered his own defense. He had a lifeline, a way out of this mess. He had to tell the judge. He had to make her listen. "I have a witness," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too desperate. He was not just trying to convince the judge, he was trying to convince himself. He had a witness. He was not alone in this. He had someone on his side. The judge, however, was not interested. She was done with the pleasantries, done with the polite back and forth. She had a case to settle, a legal dispute to resolve, and she was not interested in his last-ditch efforts to save himself. "I don't care," she said, her voice a flat, emotionless statement of fact. The words hit the young man like a physical blow. The air seemed to rush out of his lungs, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He had offered his last-ditch defense, his final plea, and the judge had dismissed it with a single brutal phrase. "I don't care." He stood there, stunned, a small, helpless sound escaping his lips. "Oh." It was not a word, but a sound of dawning realization, a sound of defeat. He had lost. He had lost the moment he had entered the courtroom without insurance. He had lost the moment he had lied to the police. He had lost the moment he had tried to argue with the judge. His lack of insurance, he now realized, was not just a legal liability. It was a moral one, a statement of his own carelessness and irresponsibility. The judge, in her cold, dispassionate way, had made him see this. He had no defense. He had nothing. The judge, her work for the moment complete, turned her attention to the task at hand. She had a name, a witness, a single person who could corroborate one of the two conflicting stories. She would call her. She would find out the truth. She looked down at the police report, her eyes scanning the third page for the contact information. She picked up the phone on her desk, a simple black phone that was a direct line to the outside world, a direct line to the truth. The young man stood there, silent and defeated, watching as the judge prepared to make the call that would seal his fate. The woman, Ms. McIntosh, watched with a quiet sense of triumph. She had been right all along. She had a witness, a truth teller, and now the judge would call her, and the truth would be revealed. The judge dialed the number, her fingers moving with a practiced, deliberate speed. The phone rang, a long, piercing ring that echoed in the silent courtroom, a sound of both hope and in despair, a sound that would, in the end, decide everything. The outcome of the case, the fate of the young man, the final word on who had the green light, all of it now rested on the answer, or lack of one, that would come from the other end of the line. The judge, her face a mask of stone, waited. The phone rang and rang. The quiet ring of the courtroom phone was a sound of suspense, a tiny, repetitive chime that held the outcome of the entire case in its hands. The young man stood frozen in place, a statue of pure dread, while Ms. McIntosh watched with a quiet, steely resolve. The judge, her face a mask of stone, held the receiver to her ear, her other hand poised over a notepad. She was a master of procedure, a woman who dealt in facts, not feelings, and the phone call was her final, crucial piece of evidence. The receiver was a direct line to the truth, a voice from the outside world that would either corroborate one story or the other, and in doing so, decide the fate of a young man and a woman who had been brought together by a single careless act. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, every breath, every heartbeat, a small, insignificant sound against the backdrop of the ringing phone. Finally, the ringing stopped. The judge, her voice calm and authoritative, began the conversation. "Is this Bleep Denham? This is Judge Judy Schindlin. Good morning." Her tone was polite, professional, in a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble dialogue of the courtroom. She was no longer a judge. She was a detective, a fact-finder, a woman on a quest for the truth. "I'm calling you because I'm in the middle of trying a case involving an automobile accident that happened on April 3rd of this year, and you were a witness to that accident." The words were a preamble, a gentle introduction that served to establish her authority and to put the witness at ease. "Could you tell me where you were standing?" she asked, her voice a low purr. She was not asking for a detailed account of the crash. She was asking for a point of reference, a place to begin her investigation. She wanted to know the witness's perspective, her position in the chaotic ballet of the crash. The woman on the other end of the line, a stranger named Ms. Denham, began to speak. The judge listened intently, her face a mask of focused concentration. She scribbled a few notes on her pad, her pen scratching a soft rhythm against the paper. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the judge, waiting for her to give a sign, to reveal what the witness was saying. The young man's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic, rhythmic beat. He was a man on death row waiting for the verdict. Ms. McIntosh, on the other hand, felt a small, triumphant smile touch the corners of her lips. She had been right all along. She had a witness, a truth-teller, and now the judge would hear her story, and the truth would be revealed. The judge nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "So you were driving, okay." Her words confirmed the first detail. The witness was a driver, not a pedestrian, not a bystander. Her perspective was that of another person on the road, someone who had seen the accident from a different angle, with different concerns. The judge then moved on to the core question, the one that had been at the heart of the case from the very beginning. Can you tell me whether the woman who was traveling straight had the green light, or whether the man who was making a left turn had a green arrow? The question was a moment of pure, unadulterated suspense. It was the moment of truth, the single question that would decide everything. The young man's heart stopped. He held his breath, waiting for the answer. The answer came, and the judge's expression, which had been so unreadable, shifted just a fraction. A small, almost imperceptible nod, a tightening of her lips, a look of quiet satisfaction. She was getting the answer she had been looking for. She had found the truth. She asked one more question, a final point of clarification. "And you were in the turn lane?" The question was a confirmation, a way of tying up the loose ends. The witness was not just a driver. She was a driver who had been in the same situation as the young man. She had been in the turn lane, a direct witness to his actions. The judge, her face a mask of calm authority, listened to the final answer. "You have made my day so much easier, Miss Denham, and I thank you very much for being so articulate and clear." "Thank you. Bye-bye now." The call was over. The judge, a woman who had seen 1,000 cases like this, now had all the information she needed. She had the truth. She placed the receiver back in its cradle, the small clatter of the plastic, a loud final sound in the silent courtroom. She looked at the young man, her eyes filled with a new kind of certainty, a kind of quiet, procedural justice. She had a story to tell, a story that would explain everything, a story that would lay out the facts in a cold, brutal, and unassailable way. The young man felt his stomach drop. He knew he had lost. He knew that the witness had not corroborated his story. He had lied, and he had been caught. The judge began her closing statement, her voice a steady, unwavering stream of facts. Your car was behind her. She was talking to the young man, telling him what the witness had said. The plaintiff had a green light, so there were green lights going in both directions. The words were a simple but powerful statement of fact. Ms. McIntosh had had a green light, a fact that the young man had tried to deny, a fact that the witness had now confirmed. She was waiting because she saw the plaintiff's car coming straight. The judge's words painted a new picture of the accident, one that was both tragic and infuriating. The witness, a driver in the turn lane, had been doing the right thing. She had been waiting for Ms. McIntosh to pass, but the young man had not. "There is no green arrow there," the judge said, her voice a flat, emotionless statement of fact. The young man's entire defense, his entire story had been built on the idea of a green arrow that did not exist. He had not just made a mistake. He had created a lie that had now been exposed. You got impatient and went around her and cut her off to make the left turn. That's why she stopped, and that's why she gave the police her name. Because you went around her car, cut her off. She was making a left turn, and there was no green arrow. The judge's words were a relentless, unsparing recitation of the truth. The young man had not just made a mistake. He had been impatient. He had been reckless. He had been a liar. He had a green light, but he had a green light to go straight, not to turn left. The witness, a woman who had been waiting patiently, a woman who had been doing the right thing, had seen him go around her, cut her off, and cause the accident. Her testimony, her simple, unadorned statement of facts, was the final nail in his coffin. The judge had found her truth, and it was not his. The judge, her work of fact-finding complete, now moved on to the final part of the process, the part that would decide the financial fate of the young man. She looked at Mrs. McIntosh, her gaze softening just a fraction. "How much was the damage to your car?" she asked, her voice a low, sympathetic purr. The question was a formality, but it was also a moment of closure. Ms. McIntosh, her voice thick with emotion, answered with a simple, heartbreaking truth. "Ma'am, it was totaled. I have the insurance company and what they paid out to." She was trying to explain the financial ramifications, the total loss of her car, the cold, hard numbers that had been the subject of her conversation with the insurance company. But the judge was not interested in the numbers. She was interested in the final verdict. "Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $5,000. We're done, thank you." The words were a final, decisive blow. The young man who had come to court without insurance, a liar and a cheat, was now faced with a judgment of $5,000, a sum that would be a financial burden for years to come. The verdict was a statement of justice, a final answer to the question that had hung in the air from the very beginning. Who had the green light? The answer, the judge now made clear, was Ms. McIntosh. The young man, by his impatience, his recklessness, and his lies, had not only lost the case, he had lost his credibility, his sense of righteousness, and a significant amount of money. The final scene was one of quiet, decisive justice, a final, unassailable answer to a question that had been in dispute for months. The judge, her work complete, had found her truth.